I am with Mark Zalesky. Mark is famous in the Bowie knife community. Probably the world's greatest authority on Bowie knives.
Give me that.
Mark, tell us a little bit about these American knives that we're looking at today.
Well, so this is my collection of Bowie knives and Bowie type knives, Bowie related knives. I'm sort of interested particularly in the American made knives and where the American Bowie knife came from. So the collection that I have here really starts from maybe 1810, 1820 with these dirk knives. These are probably New England type, but this is the sort of knife that one would carry for self-defense in an era where firearms were not reliable. If your firearm snapped, did not fire when you called upon it to fire, you needed a backup plan. So these were carried concealed, where if you needed it, you could draw it out and stick somebody. It wasn't good for much else. Wasn't good for whittling, wasn't good for carving anything, but if you had somebody that needed stabbing, that was there when shooting wouldn't work.
That would work.
So the dirks came first, and dirks were considered sort of kind of dastardly weapons because they were carried concealed typically. We have some fancy ones that may have been worn prominently, but on a civilian basis, we're not talking about naval dirks, but on a civilian basis, these were carried as backup weapons, and they were not regarded as a gentlemanly weapon. But when the Bowie knife frenzy came about in the early 1830s, it developed quickly into sort of a fad. And yes, the Bowie knife was a necessary implement in case your firearm failed. We moved from dirks into early Bowie knives, but they served the same purpose. They were there to stick somebody with if somebody needed sticking and your gun wasn't working. But very quickly we had these knives that were elegantly mounted in silver, finely made, and instead of carrying them concealed, people carried them openly. And so you would have these things that were elegantly made with fine materials, and they were expensive, but the ornamentation is such that you'd want to wear it. You'd be proud of it. It was a symbol of status. It was a sort of a gentlemanly accessory that you would wear to display, and it carried the message that, I'm a man of means, and it carried the message, don't mess with me because I've got this right handy. And that's why we have these pretty knives in the early era. So these here, these are some knives of the 1820s. This is 1830s, 30s south, moved out east. So we see a transition of knives out to maybe Cincinnati, and we see them in New York, we see them in Philadelphia. So these are Philadelphia Bowies, English and Huber, Henry Shively. This is Nathan Ames right here. These knives, we believe, are some of the first knives actually called Bowie knives. We have some letters in late 1835, October of 1835, discussing the knives they had and were trying to sell in New York and in Washington City. And these are the first Ames Bowie knives. Here's another early American knife, or possibly American knife, unmarked, 1830s Philadelphia, but you might say this is a plainer version of this right here, a cheaper version of this. Maybe this wouldn't be the one you display, but it's a very practical knife for hunting and similar design. Now if we move over here to this other case, here we are again, New York, but the escutcheon is almost the same. The studs, the handle shape, a little more ornamentation here. This is an evolution from this. And this is an evolution from this, or vice versa. This is New York with Peter Rose. This is Philadelphia, English and Huber. Here's another knife, a little different form. This is Warden Heinisch, New York makers. And this knife, I believe, was exhibited at the New York Institute in 1836, where they talked about the elegant Bowie knives that Heinisch exhibited. So here we have more roses. This is another Philadelphia knife, another rose. This is a Albany, New York maker. but you see the similar styles, the styles evolving quickly. All these knives are I think this one's a little later, but these are all pretty early American knives. And you know, it didn't take long before the English came along and took the American design, and we'll go back again here, and copied it and sent it back to us. This is a very early English knife, let's say 1835 or 6 or 7 or 8. And quickly the English found ways to manufacture a little faster and a little cheaper, and they just absolutely overwhelmed the American makers with quantity and producing high quality knives that anybody could buy. And that's sort of how we evolved from the carrying of dirks to the carrying of Bowie knives, and the first Bowie knives of the first decade of the 1830s. Those are sort of the knives that fascinate me the most.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mark.
You're welcome.